Hello, today's panel on confronting anti-Black racism in American orchestras. I'm Timothy Brown, Education and Community Engagement Manager at the Hartford Symphony Orchestra and moderator for today's discussion. I first want to thank our esteemed panelists for their willingness to share their time, stories, and wisdom with us. A special thanks goes to Randall Goosby for his leadership in helping to organize today's event. I also want to thank the HSO for hosting this critical conversation, and my colleagues at the HSO, especially Julie Jarvis, Amanda Savio, and Ashley Overton, whose tireless work have helped make this event possible. Before I introduce our panelists, a couple of housekeeping items. First, we invite you, the attendees, into today's conversation. Please use the chat feature to share a comment and to post links to relevant resources and upcoming events. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to pose a question to our panelists. We'll try to address as many of your questions as possible during the next 90 minutes. Also, a recording of today's panel discussion will be available on the HSO website by the end of the day tomorrow. It's no secret that America's orchestras are overwhelmingly white. Like many other orchestras across the country, we at the HSO only have one Black musician on our roster and no Black people on our staff. Our audiences are overwhelmingly white, and our concerts overwhelmingly feature works by white composers. But beyond the obvious imperative to diversify our field both on and off the stage, how do we create an orchestra that is truly equitable, inclusive, and welcoming? And further, what is our moral commitment to our community? Today's panelists each represent unique viewpoints and perspectives on what it means to be a Black artist, arts administrator, and music educator. And although none of our panelists are employed by the HSO, they are here because they each care deeply about our orchestra and the wider Hartford community. And now it is my distinct privilege to introduce today's panelists. Dr. Erin Flag is Chair and Associate Director at Juilliard Jazz, Secretary of the Board and Chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for the League of American Orchestras, and former Dean and Professor at the Hart School at the University of Hartford. Welcome. Violinist Randall Goosby has appeared as a guest soloist with numerous orchestras throughout the country since becoming the youngest contestant at age 13 to win first prize at the annual Sphinx Concerto competition in 2010. He has appeared with the HSO in January for the Four Seasons. Welcome, Randall. Angela Griffin is K-12 Director of Music and Performing Arts at the Simsbury Public School District and a member of the HSO Board of Directors. Welcome, Angela. Kalita N. Jones is Assistant Director for Education and Engagement at the Hart School at the University of Hartford and Managing Partner at CNJ Associates. Welcome, Kalita. Dr. Jolie Rock is a soprano, arts educator, founder and partner of Equity Arts Enterprises, LLC, former Hartford music teacher, former visiting professor at Texas Southern University and Prairie View A&M University, member, Alumni Board of Directors, and chair of Alumni of Color Task Force for the University of Hartford. Welcome to you, Jolie.
Thank you.
And Carlin Sannon is production and library manager at the Juilliard School's Jazz Studies Department and a Hartford native. Welcome to you, Carlin. So welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you again for being here today. Let's get right into it. I'd like to begin by asking you, Erin, to provide us with some historical context for today's discussion. What exactly do we mean when we say that anti-Black racism in American orchestras is systemic?
Well, first of all, Timothy, thank you so much, and thank you to your colleagues at the Hartford Symphony for hosting this panel and having this discussion. Responding to this time is an important thing for all of us to do individually, but also our institutions, and especially ones as valued as the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. To your question, anti-Black racism that we're talking about is not a personal thing. It's an institutional thing. And it is not how any one person is treating you. It is looking at the entire system. So when we say systemic racism, systemic, as the analogy I like to use, is something that exists throughout a system. For example, we're human beings, we have bodies, flesh, bone, we have nerves throughout our body. So part of our system is that nerves exist in our entire body. It's throughout, as opposed to systematic, for example, which has to do with an orderly progression of implementation. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is a part of the entire way that orchestras run. And that is something all of us who love this music, who love this art form, as someone who serves on orchestra boards around the country, I care greatly for this music. But if I care, I have to recognize the system, educationally and social system that we all came up in. And that system is racist. It's racist in how it excludes music that can be performed. It's racist in its action in terms of hiring. You've made note of some statistics, which if I may share quickly a bit of a screen here, I would like to share with the group. And when I think of the Hartford Symphony, first and foremost, I think of this man, Donald White, wonderful cellist, who came to the Hart School in the late 40s after he got his undergraduate at Roosevelt University. And he was a graduate student at Hart. And there existed at that time in the late 40s an agreement between the Hart School and the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. So he actually was assistant principal cello of the orchestra while he was doing his graduate work. And during that time, he auditioned and was admitted to the Cleveland Orchestra, where he completed the rest of his career. And I had a wonderful opportunity to speak with him probably 25 years ago, just at the beginning of my career, to understand his journey. And when I think of the Hartford Symphony, I think of him and his representation and his leadership in the field, and realizing that from that time, I thought about Hartford as a city. And when I think of the 4 largest Connecticut cities, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, and Stamford, one of the things that always stuck out to me clearly, as you can see in this chart, is the percentage of African Americans who are in the city of Hartford, as well as the highest percentage of Latino and Hispanic members. So when I came to the Hart School to be the dean and professor, I was immediately assuming, wow, what a rich diversity that exists in this city. And I'm sure that will be reflected in all manner of the city, and especially in terms of its arts. And one way we think about systems, back to your question, Timothy, I think in terms of programming, that is a system. What you present to the public, in this case as an orchestra, are not only the people on stage, but the music. And as I think about the diversity of the music and whether it represents this rich diversity that you see on the screen, we look at what we present, and just based on what I was able to ascertain over the last 8 years, 6.4% of the music presented, well over 230 works over that span, were by Black and Latinx composers. Fortunately, you'll see an uptick in 2018-19 and 19-20. But that doesn't represent, in my mind, the same type of percentages we saw on the other screen in terms of reflecting the community in that way. Now, I must be clear that there are all types of diversity. When the Hartford Symphony hired Carolyn Kwan, who's a wonderful, wonderful conductor, wonderful human being, that in itself was diverse. The first first Asian American and first female, first Asian American brought to this city as the leader, as the musical director. That is a wonderful thing to celebrate. And rightly, over her tenure, she has welcomed a number of female conductors, conductors of color, and brought in a lot of wonderful new music and collaborations, which are all very valuable and important. But in the context of this discussion, and in the context of the percentages that I presented earlier in terms of Hartford, that is a question that we should look at. And so when I say systemic racism, and the systemic discrimination, more importantly, because racism is a belief that a race is more superior or inferior to another. And that is reflected in terms of orchestras, who we hire, who we promote in terms of programming, who's leading our institutions. And so I think those are important questions to look at. And the last thing I'll say is when we think of the signs of a system, it's who is in the HSO's organization and what does the organization present to the public. And I think looking through those lens over 75 years since 1934, when the orchestra was started as a civic organization, we see that there's not been a consistent focus on embracing the city of Hartford and the wonderful diversity that exists therein.
Aaron, thank you for that a great overview and a look at not only the history, but looking at what we mean when we say systemic. I want to bring Randall, you into the conversation. We got to know each other a little bit back in January when you were here for the Vivaldi Four Seasons performance. We went out through the city to a few of the schools for educational programs. As somebody who's a touring concert guest artist, what do you see that that's happening in Hartford? Is this is reflective at orchestras across the country? You know, what is your experience as you perform with various orchestras across the country?
Well, first, thank you so much, Timothy, and to the Hartford Symphony for, again, hosting and presenting this panel. It's been a pleasure to organize this with you. As for my experience, you know, I had a wonderful time in Hartford. I felt very comfortable there. I did see in the community a great deal of diversity, as Aaron just pointed out in his slides. But I want to focus on what you were saying, going out into the schools and doing community engagement work and such. I have been engaged in this kind of work since I was 13 years old, since I began my relationship with the Sphinx competition. And since then, it's been some of the most fulfilling and gratifying work that I've been able to engage in. But one of the things that I've been realizing a lot more, and I'm ashamed to admit, really only in the past 4 to 6 months, as all of this has started to come more into light, is that a lot of the community engagement programs and so-called outreach programs that we see from the Hartford Symphony and from orchestras around the country are not sustainable in the way that would be most productive for the communities that those orchestras serve. For example, you and I went to, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 schools in Hartford. Really wonderful kids, very engaged, very interested. Musicians or not, they all seem to find something that they could take away from the program, which is my first goal, is to inspire the young people that I'm able to play with in these sorts of programs. But what I left Hartford feeling was that I have no idea what these kids are going to be able to do to support the interest that I was fortunate enough to be able to cultivate in them through these programs. As far as I know, I don't know if the Hartford Symphony has visited those schools again since January. There's certainly no program that really invites the students that we play for to be a part of the community at the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. And this has been similar to my experience with a lot of community engagement programs with other orchestras around the country. We put a black artist in front of a group of black kids, knowing that those kids will relate more to that artist and appreciate their work. And then the artist walks out of the room and the kids don't see him again, nor do they have a chance to explore some of the things that they actually were interested by in that presentation. So that's one of the things I would love to see change in the HSO and around the country, is just creating actual relationships with the communities that we claim to serve. Especially kids and youth and young people, because those are the people who eventually, if they have the opportunity to pursue a career in the arts, and if it happens to be an orchestral instrument, orchestras around the country right now who are wondering, okay, how are we going to survive this? How can we, appeal more to our community? That's how. That's the way. You can invest in the young people in your community and give them a chance again and welcome them into your organization, rather than, again, showing them what they can't do in effect and then leaving, right? As soon as they get that light bulb, that spark of inspiration. So that's been some of my experience, and it's a little bit of what I experienced in Hartford as well.
Khalida, I want to bring you into this conversation. You have used the words intentional engagement in the community. Picking up on what Randall was saying, talk a little bit about what you mean by those words, intentional engagement in the community.
Thank you for that question, Timothy, and thank you for having me and for talking about this. And sorry that my doorbell is randomly ringing. But when I speak about intentional engagement, I'm thinking about the elements of the Hartford community that should be reflected in programming and in music education offerings in Hartford. I'm not going to speak for all nonprofit leaders in the area, but I think there could be some real intentional engagement with those organizations about what the community would like to see happen, and also give them an opportunity to see why the orchestra is amazing, why it's so important to make it accessible to our children in the community. Because like Randall said, you know, you come in, you perform, and then you go, and then there's that dangling carrot, but there's no map, there's no blueprint of how to get there. And we are seeing a real tragic situation happening right now with arts being on the chopping block because of our life plot twist that's currently happening every day. Everything is shifting. And so when I think about that intentional engagement, it means that, yes, the orchestra members may have to do a little bit of retooling their mindset and restructuring the idea of what it means to be an orchestral musician. It's not just playing amazing music. It's also about going into the community, developing a rapport of trust with the community, not going in. And this is not always intentional, but this is a perception in communities like Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven. There's a white saviorism element because there's not anyone that looks like the community coming in to serve. So people may meaningfully want to come in and serve, but not recognizing that there are actions and words that they may say or do that unintentionally offend or might come across as macro or microaggressive. And there's extra work that has to happen besides practicing for 10 hours a day. There's more to it if this organization wants to be sustainable. And when I say this, I mean all. I don't just mean Hartford, I mean across the country. There is a sustainability element that is not financial that needs to be addressed and looked at. So it means you might have to have more conversations with people that are not musicians and look at what it would be like to have a relationship with a food share in the Hartford community, some local restaurants in the Hartford community. There's a lot of beautiful culture that's happening all around us. And there's so many that live around Hartford that have no idea about the deep connections there in the culture. So it requires a different kind of work ethic and a huge mindset shift that is largely uncomfortable for most people. I've had this conversation many times, and there's a level of discomfort that people are just not trying to be told that maybe things aren't what they seem. And maybe you do need to go back to the drawing board, look at what you're offering, look at the community you're serving, and see if it lines up. And if it doesn't, I don't know what's so hard about it. Just fix it. You know, like it's kind of like with all the stuff that's happening in our communities right now. Just stop and fix it, and then we can move on. So that's a little bit. I mean, I could talk forever about intentional engagement, but I think it's important for us to do it now. This is the perfect opportunity. Everyone is living in disorganized chaos. There's like a tornado happening in every organization right now. So this is the opportunity to change. This is where the breakout can happen.
I see several other panelists nodding their heads in agreement. I want to invite you in just a second, but Carlvin, I want to go to you next because you grew up in Hartford, and I'm wondering if you would mind sharing a little bit about your experience growing up with the HSO. What was your connection to the HSO, if any?
So my connection, once again, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. So I grew up in Hartford. I went to school in the North End, South End, and in Bloomfield, so the greater Hartford area in general. And the main connection to the HSO, from my perspective, and I'm speaking from the perspective of thinking of my group of friends around me who I hung out with and talked to, was very little, very, 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 very little. Now, there was once a cellist, I can't remember exactly who came to our school, who played with the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, who enlightened a lot of the high schoolers, because it was about 9th grade, that this was a career opportunity. But that was the only glimpse of someone professionally pursuing a career as a classical musician that a lot of the students that I know, including myself, had exposure to. And just in general, from walking around Hartford, hanging out in downtown Hartford, being in the North End, biking around, talking, going to restaurants, going to different types of things, Wadsworth Atheneum, Hartford Public Library. The idea of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra was not anywhere within my scope. Now, I ended up in arts administration, and I played trumpet, I played tuba. I didn't have private lessons, but my band director gave me an instrument and was like, here's a book, learn what you can from it. But in my entire scope of me trying to develop this musical experience, I did not know that the Hartford Symphony Orchestra was there as a resource. And so I know for myself, and for the people around me, for me, it was little, but for the people around me, it was definitely even less. And that's not to say there aren't efforts to go out and pursue people in the Hartford community from the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, but I definitely noticed a lack in high school, which is probably one of the most fundamental development stages of a really big lack of understanding that this was a viable kind of viable option for my life to take.
I appreciate that, Carlvin. Angela, I see you nodding your head, both when Khalida was speaking and also Carlvin. Your thoughts on this? Let's bring you in.
Well, my thoughts, first of all, I also want to say thank you very much, Timothy and Julie. This was a great undertaking, and I really appreciate your time and your commitment to making this happen. The panel today is beneficial for everyone and for the health, the current health and the future health of the orchestra, but also for the community. And I just want to say that as an HSO board member, I would like to really focus on and reinforce some of the comments in particular that Khalida made earlier in terms of the commitment to the community. Serving as a member of the Simsbury Music and Performing Arts Program, being the director of that, I see the resources, I see the opportunities that are there for our students, and the HSO should also be available for all of our students, especially for the city in which it sits. So a couple of things I wanted to share. Historically, Blacks have not been included in the orchestral field. I'm actually a professional flutist myself, and these doors have remained closed to most Black and Brown musicians. You know, as African Americans have obtained advanced degrees in performance from quality institutions of learning and higher education, the number of Blacks participating in professional orchestras has remained limited. In this particular time of advancing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, we, the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, must decide if we will remain a part of the problem or if we will become a part of the solution. And social justice and access for all is an area where really the HSO should be leading. The arts are a natural unifier. And listening to this particular time we're in, Black Lives Matter, what's happening around our country, the arts are a natural way of unifying and connecting with our community. What we need to do is to ask ourselves, what do we need to do differently? You know, the voices of the Black and Brown community are not reflected in the HSO or in most American orchestras. We lack any increase of diverse Black musicianship on our stage or in our staff, and it's no longer acceptable to maintain that status quo. It can be changed, and so I'd like to focus on those possibilities, you know, so that everyone feels included, everyone feels welcome by the HSO, and that will be reflected by a visual representation on the stage and in the administrative staff. Now, as an HSO board member, I've been a board member for 10 years. I know for a fact that the attempts have been made, and those are some of the things that Dr. Flag referred to earlier. There have been attempts that have been made in order to address diversity. However, it has not been consistent, and that's something that needs to change. It needs to be consistent regardless of any changes in leadership that occur. The comments that Randall made earlier were very accurate. I actually have sponsored students for 3 concerts where Black artists or conductors are presiding. It's been a wonderful experience for those students. But after that, we really haven't engaged in anything that's been sustained or long-term. And I believe that that's a message that we need to adhere to. And the visual is important because we're sending a message to the Black community that we care. We're sending a message that you're welcome, and we celebrate you and your presence. Our recent statement regarding the need to address the issues of systemic racism is fine, but it won't be real until we put action behind the statement. And that can happen. Everyone has to be willing to open their minds to change and to say that this is going to be inclusive for everyone. It needs to be embedded in everything that we do and the way we represent the orchestra, broadening our scope. And can I just add one more thing, Timothy?
Angela, having a little trouble with your connection there.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to bring Jolie in. You know, Jolie, I see you nodding your head a lot to what Angela is saying. It's true, you know, Angela and others, I want to thank, you know, Chef Renee, for example, have sponsored young Black students to come into programs at the HSO. We also have a wonderful Discovery Concert series every year where we bring students into the Bushnell Theater for, you know, huge full orchestra performances. You're shaking your head like that's not enough. Talk to me about that, Jolie.
It's not enough. I agree with Kalita in that you need to have intentional and intimate engagement with youth. If we want to continue to sustain orchestral music and classical musical genres for years to come, we have to have youth sitting in the audience, right? We also need to let our youth know that a career in classical music is a viable option, that they will be able to get a job when they get out of school. We spend so much money as classical artists training and honing our skills and, you know, development and professional development even after we finish schooling. It's a very expensive art form. So where do you get that return if you never see anybody that looks like you up on the stage? Where's your hope for tomorrow? So we have to change the system. We've got to get young people in the orchestra, in, like Angela said, in the administrative offices as well as conductors. And so for many years, the symphony has done programs. Yeah, great. How do you change the fact that we still don't have the visibility, right? So we, as African Americans now, begin to not trust. We want to question whether it's genuine and sincere, you know, so you're doing auditions. Who's getting hired? African Americans are auditioning, not as many as could, but why would I want to audition if I don't think I'm going to get a job, right? So you've got to do a good push, right, to make it possible. And you cannot go with this age-old excuse that the African Americans and people of color are not qualified and talented enough to perform. It's the orchestra musicians who are training the next generation, right? And so how then do you not train them well enough to get a job? We got a problem, right? Are you being sincere and really training people that are brown, youth that are brown and Black? Are you training them as well as you train white students? Are you developing relationships with them so that when you have young people who don't have the experiences and exposure at a young age to classical music, are you giving them the answers to the questions that they can't even begin to know what question to ask? So you have to give them the question and the answer because they don't have the exposure, right? And so the systemic issues are deeply, deeply, deeply rooted.
If I may, Timothy, just following up on Jolie's really good point, I think it's important for us to remember too, when we say systemic racism and discrimination, in the orchestra field, there were over 100 years where the field said, we will not audition you. Much like Major League Baseball, you could not audition. You were not allowed to play in the orchestra at all. The field said no. The field burned the bridges that would allow us to participate. Told William Grant Still and other composers, we don't want to play your music. So we, as Maya Angelou says, if people tell you show you who they are, believe them. You were not welcome. We were not welcome for years. Donald Lee White had to weather through so many people saying there's no way an orchestra will ever hire you, ever. So his persistence, it wasn't just that he was just talented. He also, thank the Lord, was persistent and ignored society's message that you cannot do this. So it is foolish, and in fact, it's insulting for the field to say, well, gee, why aren't there more talented Black and brown people here? Well, you've told us no. You've defunded our schools, not you individually, you as a society. We as a society have kept people from learning this music. We've said you can't come in, you can't audition. We're doing, and we say we're doing concerts like Bernstein's Young People's in the 50s, where we're trucking in kids to listen to an orchestra once, and orchestras go, well, we're done.
Yes.
That's a height of arrogance, and it's just not logical. But I think one reason maybe that's happening is people don't know that there are segregated unions. There were 48 years of segregated unions, which means there was a separate Black union and a separate white union. Our own Hartford Musicians Union has merged now as the Connecticut Valley Musicians Union. The history of that, how inclusive it was, is not known. And when there's trying to be even attempts to do partnerships like what Donald White benefited from, I worked with Candace, who just put something in the chat, and Joe, to say, hey, could we dig into the history of the HSO and reconstruct that to give pathways, not just for Black students, but other students to have access? And the answer was a fearful no. Even if it was beyond the CPA, because we're afraid of our jobs, we're going to keep things closed. That is not the attitude to have. So back to, I know it was a question from Rod Matthews about how do we find them? I have a whole orchestra worth of Black students at Juilliard now. Randall knows them. They can play better than you, is the vibe. So the issue is, how are we going to them to recruit them and saying, hey, we want you in this field? It's not sufficient for you to stand at your door and say, well, no one's at the door. I guess they're not interested. I guess they're not talented. It's like me inviting all of you over to my house for dinner and not giving you the address. And then saying the reason you're not there is because you're not hungry.
Exactly. And then furthermore, you have guest artists that you invite in when you're doing a work by a Black composer or a work that requires a Black soloist. And then you throw them and kick them to the curb after that. So now my whole career is only going to be in doing works by Black composers and works that are traditionally performed by African-American artists as a soloist coming in. That's crazy. It's just crazy. You can paint, for an opera professional, you can paint a white person in blackface and put them up to be Cleopatra and Aida, but you can't have me portray the role of Desdemona.
Right. So I think one thing we also have to remember with the orchestra field is that for the last 20 some years, the word was diversity, which you can think of it, or I think of it often as tokenism. And what we're now talking about is inclusion and belonging, equity, not tokenism, not just having somebody sit up there and represent it. And Angela, I honor your service on the board, and you know better than I, there have been times when the Hartford Symphony, due to a grant pressure from a foundation, has begged someone who was Black to stay on the board so they can get that money, even though the person had moved out of Hartford and moved to the other side of the country. Such was the concern for inclusion and equity. That is a tokenism gesture. That's diversity. We're now at a moment where we're asking for equal inclusion, equal representation. And that is uncomfortable for my white colleagues, my white brothers and sisters who have been in power in this field, who have privilege. And it's incredibly generous from everyone who was attending and observing this. And I appreciate your sacrifice of time and openness. But this work is difficult for all of us. It takes humility. It takes a willingness to learn and try to be empathetic and see from someone else's perspective. And that's for me, that's also for you. But if the orchestra field, particularly the Hartford Symphony, actually wants to as I know Edward Cumming had mentioned when he came on as music director, to really represent Greater Hartford and have programs, and every conductor has done great things. But the bottom line is the legacy of the Hartford Symphony, the culture, the ongoing culture beyond whoever is conducting, is not one of inclusion. It's not one where the city can accept it with great pride. Now the orchestra can say, well, there's nothing we can do about that and we're done. Or it could say, we're gonna start doing that work. It's your choice. But I and my colleagues care so much for the Hartford Symphony Orchestra and Hartford and the people there that we hope you will not take the easy road out.
Yes. I'd like to also say thank you very much for those comments, Erin. And I'd also like to say that I know some comments are being posted about the audition process. We also need to look at the way orchestras are hiring, that it becomes, in addition to the audition process itself, that it also becomes more inclusive. What are the other qualifications of musicians who are participating in the orchestra? Our musicians have a great history of performance, experience. And so how are we connecting to the city in which we sit? How are we connecting to those cities? Are we only coming to play our instrument and that's it? Because if that's the case, that's no longer the model. The model that we need needs to reach our young people. It needs to reach everyone in our community. Unfortunately, this season we had to cancel our beloved Talcott Mountain Music Festival. I love it. I go every year. I bring guests with me. I mean, I really look forward to it. Why can't we think about opening and performing a free concert in Bushnell Park? Free. Anyone can come. Anyone can bring their blanket. Anyone can attend or bring food or enjoy it. We have to become accessible so that it's not only to one target audience. The other issue that I think needs to be arisen based on some of the responses I'm seeing has to do with stereotypes. And so there's a stereotype that everyone who is Black and brown, or many people, cannot afford to attend the symphony or cannot afford to contribute. And this is a fallacy. There are many, many, many African Americans who would like to attend the symphony. However, when they come in, they see a lack of representation on the stage. That being said, why would I want to give my hard-earned dollars to an organization that I don't see also reaches out to all youth so that it's everyone? For those who are in Simsbury who are watching and know me and know my leadership in our department, I believe in unifying, and I believe in opportunities for all of our students. And if I see a lack thereof, I'm going to talk about that lack. And we're going to see how we can work together in order to do that. And I find when people open their minds to it and they make up their minds that they're going to do it, the result is phenomenal. I think of some out-of-the-box work that some of our teachers did, and in doing that, they reached the community, they reached the students. The students saw themselves represented in Black composers or works that they were performing. Parents were learned and educated, and we have to be willing to step out of the box. It's not only about the audition, it's about what you do outside of the audition in that community in which you sit.
And when you talk about auditions, let's talk about blind auditions, because somebody brought it up in the chat. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at blind auditions, you're putting up a sheet, whatever, partition, so that you can't see the artist performing. One, you need to keep that sheet up for the entire audition if you're going to use it, right? It needs to be up from the beginning to the end through the playing and the talking, right? But then let's talk about inherent bias, right? If an orchestra member, a really well-trained musician, can listen to a performer play, having never heard that performer before, and then can sit and say, I think you studied with Kamens down at Rice, right? Just because I can hear you, I know who you studied with and what institution you went to, oftentimes. So I hear your voice. How can I then cut off all the other inherent biases that are going on in my head to then really blindly look at your performance. It's impossible. It is impossible. Okay?
Oh, please.
No, you go ahead.
And I'm sorry, Jolie, forgive me for jumping in too early. But there were a lot of questions about the blind audition process, which is viewed as the holy grail in this field, as the solution to all problems, as some panacea, which it was never intended to be. If you know the history of the blind audition process, which started solely in the 70s, it was actually to counter nepotism and favoritism from conductors who would hire either their mistresses, their students, or principal players. So it was about favoritism and nepotism. It was never about diversity. Fortunately, the one result of that advent has been the increase substantially in women being admitted to orchestras since the 70s. And so that has been a wonderful, I won't say full solution, but wonderful help to increase gender diversity. It has done nothing to move the needle for 40, 50 years on racial diversity. And so for us to continue to cling to it like a favorite tree to solve all problems implies that we're really not serious about solving the problems. I'm not saying blind auditions are bad. They had some positive benefit, but understanding what they're for. And as Jolie was mentioning, and I'll just add, if I may, to the second point, blind auditions in orchestras have nothing to do with the job of playing in an orchestra. It is the worst alignment between a job application process and what the job is. Unless the job is standing on the stage by yourself, playing 2-minute short pieces, then this is not appropriate for orchestras. There's no chamber music, idea of playing with people, blending your sound, blending your articulation. It has nothing to do with, as Angela was mentioning, what special gifts, what uniqueness do you bring to our organization? How can we inspire you to stay here, 10, 20, 30 years and make your career here? We don't even ask who you are. We don't care who you are. We don't care how you play with people. We don't care what special skills you want to bring. So to blindly hold on to this process is fascinating to me because it's not aligned with the job and it doesn't do anything about diversity. It's a scapegoat to avoid the fact that an orchestra needs to go attract. You need to go get the people to be at that front door. And people don't want to do that work. And so I think we need to reconsider the audition process in general for orchestras. Why this process for the Berlin Philharmonic and the Spokane Washington Symphony and the Hartford Symphony and the Cleveland Orchestra is the same makes absolutely no sense. But we cling to that because of groupthink. So I'll stop with that on the audition thing.
No, thank you. This is an incredibly important topic. In terms of the recruitment piece, Randall, when you were here in January, you might remember I talked to you about the idea of having a fellowship program where we would bring, students from either like the Hart School or other area schools into the Hartford Symphony through a mentorship program. These students would perform on Masterworks concerts and Discovery concerts and like all of the concerts, do education work, things like that. And we would be specifically recruiting Black and Latinx musicians for these programs. And I just wanted to raise the question, what about a fellowship program in terms of a pathway and a recruitment strategy? Randall, to you first.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. There are a number of already existing fellowship programs like that for Black students who have been fortunate enough to be involved in the field of classical music. My response to you now would be that's great. I'm all for it. But again, what's more important is the next generation of community members of kids that we are trying to bring into the orchestra and trying to cultivate an interest in them for the long term, right? It's wonderful to seek out the many Black musicians who are out there and who are ready for a fellowship program like that. They are there. Thank you for considering a fellowship that caters to them. But again, there are many exponentially more, exponentially higher number of young people who won't get to that point where they can pursue a fellowship like that. So in my mind, that's where my priorities are with the kids who don't yet know that this is something they can do. I'll keep it short because I know that some other people may have some interesting points on this one as well.
Kalita, I see you smiling. I want to bring you into this question of the fellowship.
Well, I was smiling for a lot of reasons, Timothy. There was a lot of gospel being preached on this screen today. I think it's time for us to revolutionize the audition process. Like, enough already. You know, I mean, there's all of these unions and all these rules, and the people on this screen are the ones who don't even get a seat at the table. So why not shift the system? Why is there so much red tape to make a more progressive ensemble? Why is there so much red tape to go into communities that people assume aren't safe? You know, like I struggle with that, because these are the very communities that we're responsible for, because we reside either in them or around them. So that is our responsibility as a cultural arts institution. And we have failed in that respect. Yes, there are things that have happened over the last couple of decades that have been, you know, marginal increases, having concerts with bringing in Black composers and Black performers, Latinx, but it's not enough. Also, I appreciate actually that someone brought up us going, the Hartford Symphony, bringing in thousands of Hartford students and, you know, having them sit in the audience and have them be excited and engaged. And then we go drop them back off and we forget about them until next year. So a revolutionary thing would be to break up the orchestra, and they should come to the community and actually have a residency there and spend some time there developing a rapport, developing a relationship. And for those of you that think money is the problem, it's not. If you create some really creative, sustainable ecosystems in these different parts of the community, the money will come. I'll tell you right now, a lot of these philanthropists and funders are looking real hard at every institution across the country. They're looking at your board, they're looking at your planning, they're looking at your strategic planning. And I suggest a lot of folks start strategically planning for the next 90 days when this money runs out, or you're gonna have some strategic problems that is not going to save you. And it's a big deal. And I'm so passionate about it because I don't understand why it's so hard. Like money to me is an excuse. It's a cop-out. You know, there's so many talented people in Hartford, so many voices that are totally ignored. And it's unacceptable because there is money. There is money in this city. Maybe it might be used in some funny ways. You know, I'm not going to get into the politics of that. That's not my job today. My job today is to talk about how we can combat the assumptions, the aggressive ideas about why Black people don't want to listen to classical music. That's not true. I grew up listening to it. My parents made it a part of my life. I understand that it starts at home, but you can't use that as your cop-out either, because that's home. When they're in school, are you coming in there? Are you intentionally serving and doing the work? If the answer is, yeah, we do it 3 times here and there, then that's not enough. That's just, it's not acceptable. You're part of the community. You're taking community money. You need to do some real community work. And it's going to be uncomfortable. Some folks are going to feel out of their element. And to that, I radically say, maybe it's time for you to move out the way.
Mm-hmm. So I want to add a little bit. First of all, yes, Randall, snaps on that. Preach. We're having some church up in here. I love it. That's all right too, right? Okay.
Yes, it is.
I wanted to add a little bit more because several people have asked about the fellowships. First of all, as a board member of the League of American Orchestra, I would direct you to our multi-year study of orchestra fellowships that you can download for free off the League website. One of the takeaways from that is it's not a panacea, but it's clearly important for you to do it right. Most orchestra fellowships, when they started in the mid-'80s, they would bring in 1 Black person. Now imagine you're 1 Black person brought into a sea of whiteness that doesn't want you there, that views you as not only a token, you're taking away some worthy white person's job. And the orchestra is asking us to mentor you and help you. Imagine how that went down. So if there's not a cohort of people who can support each other, and most importantly, but following up on Kalita, it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with culture. If the orchestra hasn't bought into the importance of investing to fix the discrimination for decades that has been perpetrated on our people by this field, If you haven't embraced that, and as I know many orchestras around the country who have principal players in X section, who they know they can't bring in a fellow into that section because that person is going to sabotage the experience. So it's not that fellowships are good and or bad, it's how you do them. If that person feels welcomed, back to that dinner I'd love to have at my house with all y'all coming over for some barbecue. My goal is for you to feel welcomed, for you to want to be there, to ask what's your dietary restrictions, what things might you bring to the table that we can work with. If you have that attitude about your fellowship program, and it's about investing in the future in this person, then that can be great. Several fellows have told me they've had a great experience because there was more than one, because the orchestra got its culture in line and ready before they arrived and invested seriously in their development. But if you're not willing, if your organization is not ready to do that, don't do this to people.
Yes, I agree with that, Dr. Flag. And in addition to that, you know, putting on the table that in order to create that welcoming feeling, we also have to realize that everyone has bias. We all have biases, and they need to be addressed. There's plenty of training out there for everyone. As an arts administrator going through the UCAT program, I had to go through an anti-bias training and a test in order to help me to be able to assure that I was responding to students as fairly as possible and staff in any situation. All, in my opinion, all American orchestras, staff, musicians, board members, conductors need to take this training. We all need to, because the bias is there. It's embedded in our society, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, or whether we realize it or not. And so that's something that has to change. It's something that you have to realize that it kind of happened to you as you're growing up. You need to throw off all of these biases, but you can't do it on your own. We all need to have that training. The other thing I wanted to say has to do with connecting with the community via partnerships. So we've talked about how can we do that? What are some things we can do? How can we find these musicians? Well, there are plenty of organizations in Connecticut and all over the country, frankly. So if I'm looking for Black and Brown staff members, also administrative staff and musicians, because we're talking about both things here, we have to do some seeking out, which is what we're talking about. There are organizations such as the Boys and Girls Club of Hartford, the YMCA, the Legacy Foundation, the Amistad Foundation, the Artist Collective. There are multiple organizations and pathways and connections that we can make. This sends a message of good intent, follow through, and that we're welcoming everyone to be a part of the orchestra. So I think that these are the types of out of the box thinking we're talking about, stretching, growing. It's not healthy for any organization to remain the same for 25, 50 years. Every organization, everything in our fabric and our DNA says we have to change, we have to grow. And so that's what we need to do. And this is what this conversation is about. How can we get out of the same little box? And if we don't change, we're going to be left behind. The American League of Orchestras is addressing diversity head on. We need to be on that train. And if we don't, I worry about this orchestra continuing. Our board wants to address diversity. I am completely appreciative of that. And that being said, we need to take action. You know, we need to really take action. Some of the things that are being raised here today are unique, they're new. There may be some things we've talked about, but the next step is action. It's not dialogue after dialogue after dialogue. It's what's the action that we're going to take?
Yeah,
Ms. Jolie, Dr. Rock, I promise I'm gonna pass it back to you. I'm looking and scrolling and listening and trying to process. This is a moment for all, there's over 200 people on this call. This is a moment for folks to listen. This is not your opportunity to list off all the things that you've been doing, because we're not there. If we were there, it would be okay, but it's not okay right now. So I know that there's a lot of discomfort, and then there's a lot of people that are internalizing this personally. This is not personal. I always try to lead with my heart, but it's personal when it comes to what work are you doing internally, because nothing will change if you're not doing the work at home before you come into an organization and start tearing up stuff there. So if you're not doing that work, if you're not reading, if you're not researching, if you don't have no Black friends, like, these are things that you need to address before you start going into communities and trying to affect change. Miss Jolie, all you.
Yes. So that's awesome, girl. My nephew is an intern at Minnesota Symphony, and so he is one of those young people that is sitting on the Diversity and Inclusion and Equity Committee, and trying to do some of the work for making change in an institution that has been racist and white supremacist for many, many years. And I know that that's a strong statement, but we all know that it's truth. It goes to the point, Erin, of what you were saying earlier, of putting young people in these positions and then expecting them to create the change for a system that hasn't been working and it is broken. One person can't make that change. And so we have to learn to get more people of color, representative, hopefully, of the community in which we serve. So if your diversity on your boards and your administration and in the orchestra matches the diversity of the community that you're serving, okay, not just the white community in the suburb, but the internal community at large. So if it was Hartford, the greater Hartford community, not just the city or the suburbs, but all of it, then you start to get a better microcosm that's more true to what your community needs. And you can come up with ideas that work for more people than just the people that you've been serving for hundreds of years, okay? So that is huge. I mean, what type of employee is an American orchestra looking for? Are they looking for one who's just gonna work for pay? Because we go back to the service and salary thing. Are you only performing because you want to earn a living, right? We have to learn to give back to our communities, and it can't just be about giving, back to the poor people. It has to be about justice, right? It has to be about justice and equity and equality and having wonderful music and people being exposed to wonderful music, and us doing that as a community together. And it can't be, I'm going to tell you what to do because I know what's best, because this is how we've done it for years.
Right. If I can just jump in on that, so much truth. It's so great to hear so much truth. When we think of, so many people are asking in the chat, well, where can we find people to hire and what can we do now? Just do it, hire them. You're all looking at Carl Vincennon, who is a native of Hartford, born and raised. He is an amazing operations manager. My phone should be ringing off the hook for people to try to snatch him from Juilliard to run their orchestras. But as I joke with him, his hair probably is hurting him. But people aren't willing to check out what a great administrator he is growing into and becoming. But I see that. I'm looking for that. Are you looking for that? Or are you just looking for the things that don't make you feel comfortable? Someone's hair, how they speak, where they're from. The question is, do they have the skills? And so as the bottom line is, if you want the certain diversity, you just go get it. But you don't want it bad enough. We all remember in high school, there was someone we were attracted to. We wanted to get their number, but we were scared, we were afraid. well, they may not like me, or what should I do? Do you want the number or not? And that's the only question. Go get it.
Yep.
And we're watching you because you're not getting it for 70 years.
I want to talk about, thank you, Erin. I also want to talk about specifically to the musicians, because this is, I want to share a personal story that may be helpful. And there are things that we can do as an institution. There are also things we can do individually. And we've talked about that today, where the internal work begins. And as a young Black student, I was in Tampa, Florida at the time. I've been playing the flute since I was 12. I got to the high school orchestra, and my high school orchestra teacher said, "You're going to need to really start taking lessons." And I said, "Well, I've been taking lessons for years with someone." She said, "No, you need to take lessons with someone in the symphony." So somehow or other, I was able to make contact with the second flutist in the Florida orchestra at that time. My family lived in a Black neighborhood. He was willing to come out to my house. He provided those lessons right in our kitchen. Every week I had those lessons. I shared with him my dreams. And at that time I was still putting things together. He figured out that our orchestra, I was fortunate enough to have a regional orchestra, and we were playing the Shostakovich Festival Overture. It was a very challenging piece for me as a young flutist. He worked and worked and worked with me until I was in a place where I was able to play that piece. And he made the connection that the orchestra was also going to be playing that piece. Would I like to come to hear them perform it? So he provided 2 free tickets for my mother and I to come to attend that concert. Now I can still see it as I'm talking to you about it. Sitting up in the balcony, watching the performance. And what made it exciting for me went beyond just the fact that it was a piece that I was playing in school. It was a fact that I knew that musician on the stage, and he knew me, and he cared about me and saw me. And this is something that we don't realize that we need to do. We need to reach out to others from where we are. We have power to do this. We have the power. When we talk about young people, we talk about students, we have to make that reach. So musicians, this is something that can happen today. This is something that can happen today. If you're an educator, you're doing it. But you need to do it more. If you're not an educator, talk to the educators about how they're doing it, because it is possible. And one person can make the difference in the life of a child. One person can open the door. And that particular concert, in my experience with him, catapulted me to say, I want to become a professional musician. I want to go on in my career. If he hadn't done that, I wonder if I would be sitting here today on this panel and having this conversation and the ability to impact lives. So we have to think beyond where we are, but we also have to start where we are and do something. It's not okay for us to shake our heads and say, we tried, we can't do anything more. We have to continue in that journey. So I just wanted to share that.
Can I say something? Sorry, Dr. Flag, were you going to say something?
No, you got it. You got it.
Okay.
You got it.
You know, I'm trying to stay calm on this call.
Don't be calm. Got you.
Woo, okay, so
Be you.
you know, I think that there's some uncomfortable elephants that need to be just right out front. So we have the AFM, right? We have the union that makes a lot of rules and makes sure that there's a lot of red tape. And I know that this is very uncomfortable to hear, but the union is a large part of why we don't have balanced orchestras that reflect the United States of America. I would dare to say we need to look at balancing the orchestra, which may mean white people, Asian American, they may have to be scoot over a little bit in order to balance out the equation of the orchestra. We're talking about radical revolutionary change. We're not talking about the status quo. We're not talking about we hang up on this call and we check off. We're talking about big changes. And while I'm not well versed, so I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert in the union or any of that stuff. I'm hearing that it's the musicians and the orchestra who negotiate the audition rules. I don't know. Maybe someone else can speak to that on this call. But what I'm saying is, just like restaurants are having to reinvent themselves, Orchestras need to reinvent themselves. They
Right.
need to open up the table. They need to extend the leaf in the table, add some more chairs. Maybe some folks need to get up out their chair, pack their bags, and keep it moving. Thank you for your service. It's been real.
Right.
I mean,
Let me just dive in on that as one who knows a good thing about AFM. And Khalida, I don't want you to just speak your truth. Doesn't matter what people are saying. Okay. First of all, the AFM, like most unions, is supposed to, its job is to protect work for its members. It doesn't protect work for people who aren't members. And let's remember our segregated union history in the 20th century until 1975. So unions are made up of members, but the union's job is to fight for work for members, not for non-members, not to align with the strategic goals of an organization. So with that there, if I'm a musician in an orchestra, like many of my colleagues, and my union has negotiated with my orchestra in a way that restricts freedom that my orchestra tomorrow would like to expand into, it does take, as my friend Robert Levine, who wrote that note to you, it does take the musicians in that orchestra to stand up and say, we have decided we want to make a change. For example, due to COVID, we would like to allow the orchestra administration to use some of the recordings we've made as a way to share with our public. And we're willing to work out something so no one feels ripped off. But because we can't do our concerts, we now want that video content, the recordings of us playing at our best, to be shared. It's in our best interest for that to happen. But if the CBA says, collective bargaining agreement, says you can't share that due to a media agreement, it's up to the orchestra members to change it. But most individual musicians will not do that. There's not a hive mind, which is why you have orchestra committee leaders who sometimes marshal more power than they should. And you have unions who want to keep the status quo, who hurt the actual organizations that musicians want to work with. So unfortunately, both the AFM and ICSOM and ROPA, which are other unions for orchestra members, they look bad. The musicians who are represented by those unions look bad. The organizations, i.e. the orchestras, look bad. Oftentimes, one or more of those members are sitting there going, we'd like to make a change, but nobody wants to move. So you are right to say AFM, ICSOM, ROPA, and the musicians in an orchestra. If you're not going to make a change to address the issues of equity and diversity and inclusion, if you're not going to stand up and say, hey, I vote another way, let's get together, then it's on you. Egg is on your face as well. So there is structure, but it is important for musicians to speak up and for CEOs and administrators of orchestras to say, we have to make this change.
Now,
Yes. And I do want to say there are musicians out there. So I'm sitting here looking at and staff members. Randall Goosby, top-notch musician. Gareth Johnson, violinist who came, top-notch musician, both from the Sphinx organization. We've learned about Carlton and his history. There are staff members to be hired. There are qualified musicians to be hired. But we have to make the reach. We have to show that we're interested. How can we partner with the Sphinx organization? And I understand that it's the time of COVID. I saw something about a comment about that in the chat. We understand that, but we can do some of these things digitally. We don't have to be held to a box by that. Why can't we make a digital connection like what we're doing today? So those are some of the things that can revolutionize that. As we're talking about changing unions and what can change, we have to also look at how can we make that reach. Where are the musicians that we're looking for? The organizations do exist, and they're fine, outstanding musicians. They just often don't have the opportunity to get onto the stage or into the audition process, or to say, we really want you to come to audition. So let's do that, and let's do it consistently.
And the reality is that a lot of the young artists that are stellar are going and finding other jobs.
Amen.
They're doing other things.
And that's something
They're not coming into the orchestras. And if I go into looking at being a guest artist, which in an orchestra, I would be a guest artist. You know, why don't we do some innovative things like, oh, let's have a season with only Black artists and artists of color as soloists, as guest artists, right? We do it, you do it all the time, and you've been doing it for years with all white artists as guest artists. Do something to show in a major way that you are committed to change, and then make that change happen over time, you know, after you do a big splash, right? Be open to new ideas, you know, be creative. There are education programs that work with the community, like Nashville's Accelerando program. There's YOLA, the Atlanta Music Project, Play on Philly. There are lots of stellar programs out there. Look at them and see how you can create something similar, but based on your demographic and the community that is in the greater Hartford area.
I just want to add one quick thing. I'm learning so much because I've not had a lot of experience playing in an orchestra. You know, I've taken the guest artist role a number of times. So my point will speak from that perspective. If you are listening to this conversation and you are now finally becoming aware of some of the names of guest artists who are Black who you can invite, if your first thought is, oh, February's coming up, oh, Martin Luther King Day is coming up, please check yourself. Please, with all due respect, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, right? If I feel that the only time I'm welcome in a concert hall, on a stage, in front of an audience who's probably mostly white, is in February, I do not feel like I belong the other 11 months of the year, right? So please just take into account that, you know, this is not, again, it speaks to the tokenism question. If you're only engaging Black guest artists for Black programs, for Black holidays, which aren't even nationally celebrated, there needs to be some reevaluation that goes on. I just wanted to add that. I hope that I don't have to speak too long about this. I hope that it's universally understood, but I know that it's not. So I just
and Randall, furthermore, you did not go to school for 8 years or up to 8 years and study your instrument for 15, 20, 30 years on only African-American music.
I did not.
We have studied and learned on the masters.
Whoa. We got masters and Black composers as well.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. Don't.
I would only augment Randall's point, excuse me, just having coached many young artists in this. It's everything Randall said is true.
Absolutely.
It's also helpful to negotiate. So when you get called for that Porgy and Bess role, you tell your agent, she'll consider that as long as that there's an omneris or another role in the previous season that will be bundled with it. So I'll play your February concert because you need me to do that. That's what you care about. But I need the Mendelssohn in October, the subsequent season. And Hartford, as a specific orchestra, clearly has adopted certain guest artists that in a review of 8 seasons, I see every other season. And that's not a bad thing. You know, Serena Hong, wonderful violinist, grew up in Hartford, went to Juilliard, love her at heart. It's great that the Hartford Symphony Orchestra is engaging her, helping her develop her career. That's great. But it should also happen for other artists as well. So yes, it's insulting if that's all you think, which is exactly what happens. But we also need to be empowered to say, okay, you may want to consider me for that, but I also want this or I'm not doing it. And by the way, here's my fee. Well, that's more than what we planned for. Well, good luck. Yeah. You know, that's also a part of it. And to colleagues who are responding to the suggestion by Kalita about making a change. And I love their sense of some of my friends, Kyle Hoyt and others I went to school with, are like, oh my goodness, that's insulting. How do you think we feel? How do you think we feel for 100 years?
More than 100.
So welcome to the
400
party,
years. 400 years.
And the reality, Erin, with that is also, just because we're Black doesn't mean that we are an aficionado of Black music. It does not mean that. It doesn't mean that we aren't, but how about you ask me what my specialty is instead of assuming it?
So Timothy, I need you to help manage us because we're having church here. Are there some
So,
questions that we're not addressing that we need to make sure get covered because we want to respect our people's time?
absolutely. And my apologies. My internet crashed right in the middle of our wonderful conversation. So my apologies for that. I wanted to bring up a question, and this is something that was raised both prior to the panel. Somebody wrote us with this question. It also came up during our conversation. And I'm just going to read the question. As an African-American music educator who is an avid lover of Western art and music, I've been called white many times by my peers growing up as a child. When I try to introduce Western art music to students in urban areas, it has not been received well because many of the students are not interested in doing what they consider to be white music. I'm aware of culturally responsive teaching, and I am aware of people of color who have composed Western art music, but the students are not all interested in that. So I'd like to direct this question first to Carlvin and Randall as the younger panelists today, just to respond to this person's question. Carlvin, to you first, please.
I think if you look at it, if you look at classical music in relation to a lot of other industries, you'll see kind of a common theme emerging in like, oh, why aren't Black people in this industry? And the one thing you'll keep on seeing is access, realization that there's opportunity there, and continued consistent and years of that happening. Why aren't there that many people, why aren't there that many Black people coding? It's not that Black people can't code, they don't have computers. There's access and connections to that music, to that industry or whatever you want to call it, that isn't there. And so I guess what you see, like I grew up in Hartford, I grew up in the North End, and unlike the panelists here, I did not grow up listening to classical music. I listened growing up to compa and a lot of hip hop and occasionally whatever pop showed up on the radio. But when I found classical music, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing stuff. This is great. Like stuff is great. Why am I just learning about this at 19? You know? So it's not that it inherently has something that people in the community just go, that's lame. Once you give somebody the chance to kind of sit there for more than their initial 2 seconds of this sucks, they go, oh wait, no, this is actually good. It's not about the quality of it. We know the quality of the music's great. It's about selling the experience of what it is. And so for most people's perception of the experience is, at least speaking from Hartford, I don't think like when I'm talking to my friends to hang out, we don't go, oh, let's go to the museum. Oh, let's go to the Bushnell. Oh, let's do this. We say, let's go to Bushnell Park to sit and lay around. Or I don't say, let's go to a library and grab books and read. You know, there's certain ideas behind those institutions that you're also combating that people have formed from ignorance because they don't have exposure to it. And so if the situation is where you're bringing it up to young people and they aren't doing that, then, or bring up to young people and they aren't responding in a passionate way that you want, it's also, you're not going to get people on board for your passion right away. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it might go away. Sometimes the person that you're fighting with the most ends up being the one that makes a successful career in it. So I think it's important to realize that it's not an inherent trait or something where it's just like, man, these other Black folks not getting on board. It's because they don't know. Just like if I start talking about something computery or something else that most people don't have exposure to, regardless of race or wherever they're going, they're just like, I don't care for the most part.
Thank you. Randall, same question. And also Randall, you know, just sort of an additional question. Was there somebody who helped to mentor or support you in your growth as a classical violinist?
Thanks, Carlvin, for that great answer. Thanks, Timothy, for the question. I'll take the first part of it, which I'll basically just echo everything Carlvin said. I mean, key word is access, exposure. You know, I started violin at age 7, and I loved it without ever knowing that it was weird that it might be weird that I'm Black playing classical violin, right? It took me until I was 13 or 14 when I had my first encounter with the Sphinx organization, first of all, to understand that, okay, wow, there's other Black people who do this. Maybe it is a little weird that I'm Black. Like, should I be doing this? Second of all, up until that point, because Sphinx, as a part of their application process for contestants, requires the recording of a piece by a Black or Latinx composer. Up until that point, composer, the word composer in my mind meant old or dead white guy. Simple as that, right? I had no idea that Black people were a part of this culture, were a part of this industry and institution. And again, it goes back to access. We've talked about most possible ways that we can address this, in our schools and in these communities, right? The kids who think, or who will say to other kids, specifically Black kids, oh, you're white, you play classical music, like, you're not really Black. They don't understand, right? They haven't been given any reason or incentive to understand, right? Because they have not seen that, first of all, this is a career that Black people can pursue, but have also seen that it's not something that Black people are meant to sit in a concert hall and enjoy, for a number of reasons that we've brought up in this conversation. So again, just going back on a lot of the things that we talked about, it's about access. It's about reaching out into these communities where these thoughts and perceptions live and uprooting them and showing them why that's not the case. Why they actually, yes, you can be Black and pursue classical music, right? I mean, what? Yeah, it's a tough reality to face, but I think, again, if we can all find a way, as Khalida was saying, to listen and learn from conversations like these, we'll figure out ways to combat a lot of these questions.
I taught in Hartford for 20 years, and one of the things that I made primary in my goal for teaching was that as a teacher, I was responsible to expose students to things they had not been exposed to. Okay. And so when I work with my students, what I would say to them is, we can do rap. We could do R&B, we could do soca, we could do reggae, we could do reggaeton, we can do all of it, but we're also going to do classical music and opera. And I took them to Connecticut Opera and got them free tickets to go. And I took them to the symphony. And at night performances, I would meet them and their parents and chaperone them and do what I had to do as a teacher to get them exposure and opportunity, because many of them did not have that. And and some of them, their parents could afford it but didn't necessarily have the exposure themselves. So somebody needed to expose them. The other thing I said to them was, I'm not asking you to like it or not like it. I just want you to listen. So that gives them the opportunity to have an open mind and just accept the information and experience the information. And then later, they can decide, much later, they can decide whether they like it or not. But it's just like food. How can you know you don't like Japanese food if you never tasted it before?
If I can just add on to that, to the questioner, and I know there was a concern about how, as an African American, did we deal with that? So I think it's fair to say, by the shaking of heads, we've all gone through getting the pushback on loving classical music. And I grew up in South Central LA, Bloods and the Crips, so Beethoven wasn't quite on everyone's, list. And so the word Oreo was something I understood long before I ate one. And so I heard that many, many times. And my response to that was, as has already been said, first of all, I like it. I don't really care what you think. I like it. And secondly, was understanding that they just hadn't been exposed to it. They were actually reacting to the system that we all are a part of. The system said, this is what being authentically Black means. You must like basketball, you must like hip hop, that's what the system is saying you have to be. Fortunately, my parents taught me about the system, be it the media, literacy, and then the system. And says as a church-going person, there's the world, and then there's what the Lord wants us to do. So I understand that there were different things. And so exposure is it, but exposure without empowerment and saying you can like whatever you want to like. And after a while, those students came up, some, not all, they admitted, man, we were wrong, man, you sound great. That's it. We just didn't know about that. I think is something that we need to gift our young people. But also in the pipeline, all of us, I'm sure, had people who pulled us up, who said, I see something in you. Why don't you hear some tickets? For me, it was the LA Philharmonic. The couple of the trumpet players there had heard me at a competition and called my teacher and got me tickets. I had to take an hour-and-a-half bus from South Central down to go to the concerts by myself, and I just got into it. But if they hadn't reached out to me, if Wynton Marsalis hadn't met me at 14, or I hadn't met him at 14, and he let me have it. He let me have it in a way that says, I believe in you. You need to do this work. get Schlossberg, page 35, and work on exercises number 6 to 12, and get the Arbenz book and shed on this in the back. I was 14 years old, and I remember thinking, this is the first time someone has taken my interest as seriously as I'm taking it. My father actually got mad because he brought me for my birthday to Westwood Playhouse, all the way in the rich white area, so I can hear this guy play the trumpet. And he took me backstage and went and said, here's my horn, play something for me. And I played the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, first movement. And he said, man, you sound sad. You need to work on your articulation. You need to work on this. Here's what you need to do. I was overjoyed. My dad was pissed. He said, man, how dare this guy talk to you like that? I said, man, that's what a serious musician is like. I finally met a serious musician who took me seriously. So all of the musicians in the Hartford Symphony, you know, in your own way, however the Lord provides for you, how are you touching people like that? Are you looking to do that every single day for yourself as an artist, but also as an ambassador of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra? Find your Carlvin, find them and pour into them. And if you're not doing that, and frankly, if all of you aren't doing that, then you're perpetuating the unfortunate situation where you become irrelevant. So we all have to do that. We're doing that right now, even though some people got mad at what we said. That's okay. We're pouring into you all right now. And if the field can do that, like our composers, all of our great composers, men and women all over the world, all over time, have poured into those sheets of dots to make this music, they're gonna love this. We need to be that same way about this music to be more inclusive, whatever it takes.
Thank you, Erin. We are starting to run short on time. I do have one question that I want to ask the panel. Are there orchestras around the country that are good role models to follow when
My vibe would be no, be yourself. Quit copying everybody. No town is like Hartford. Be like Hartford. Be the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. For all of Hartford, do that.
Yeah.
We need, go ahead, Carlvin.
Kind of speaking to that, you have to create the infrastructure to know the community you're in deeply. Do you know the community leaders? Do you know the people that are in that community? Do you know what they do in their day out? It's not the same that's going to happen in San Francisco. It's not the same that's going to happen in Philadelphia. So even just like looking at the stats, like, oh, Black in Connecticut, like we know we have Black people. Go another layer deep. Not all Black people are from one spot on the earth that says Black. There's a lot of Jamaicans in Hartford. There's a lot of African Americans, multiple generations in Hartford. There's a migration that happened. There's a white flight that happened. There's a separation that happened with the highway. There's a whole history to Hartford that every city has its own history. It's a post-industrial city. What does that mean? You know, so go into those layers behind what makes this city what it is, and then how you can fit within that to contribute to this community that's vibrant and has been there for many, many, many years.
Agreed. We need to lead. We need to be an orchestra that leads in this field. And there's enough diversity, there's enough talent, there are enough arts organizations. Hartford is culturally rich, many, many layers. We need to lead the way. We need to actually be an example for other orchestras across the country. And so I hope that as a result of this conversation today, that is exactly what we will be doing.
I just want to say that, like Carlvin said, there is no blueprint, but what there is an opportunity here. As the Hartford Symphony is a regional orchestra, you can actually dynamically lead the way for what the infrastructure of this could look like. And I hope that as people process what has been said today, and you work through your feelings about things, and you're able to compartmentalize those feelings and start taking them and creating actions around them, I hope that you do reach out to the individuals on this panel, myself included, and have a conversation and ask, and be prepared for pushback, be prepared for that discomfort, because to go forward as we are is to have wasted all of your energy and everyone's energy on this call. So I challenge people, especially in the Hartford area, to start having these conversations and start creating action plans and being intentional and being real. Because if we don't set that example for our babies that are looking at us right now who are terribly lost, there is no one leading the way right now. And if we as a cultural institution could actually lead the way by example and give them someone to look up to and something to look forward to, man, it would change the entire infrastructure of this community and quite possibly the Eastern Seaboard. So I challenge us to really dig in. Buckle up, because it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be mad. You're going to feel a type of way about things, but that's the only way for change to occur.
And you have to look and change your internal ideas first. Because if you don't recognize that you play a part, every one of us, in this racist society, then you cannot make a meaningful change. First, you have to change yourself, and then you can reach outside of yourself and begin to work with others to make huge change. And it has to happen. The time is now, and we need people to act. We need people to help, to provide funds for young people to be trained, to go give back to within the community, to perform in the community, to mentor young people. We need that change now.
Well, that is a wonderful place to end. I just want to thank all of you for being so vulnerable and sharing from your hearts, from your own experiences, sharing your really brilliant and innovative ideas. I think that the HSO has a huge opportunity as a smaller regional orchestra to be a leader. And I just, again, want to thank you so much for spending the time with us. To those of you who are watching, please be in touch. We want to work with you. We want to hear from you, especially if you are in the Hartford community. But also if you're at other orchestras and other organizations across the country, let's do this work together. Again, a special thanks to the HSO for hosting this event. I know I've learned so much, and thank you so much again.
Thanks so much, everyone. This was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Happy to be
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a
Bye.
pleasure to be a part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.